Hi, today we're going to talk about international trade. Strictly speaking, it's an economics topic, and normally it's included in the international economics or trade economics courses. But because international trade is a foundation for international business, it kind of makes sense to include it in an international business course. So we're going to talk basically about economics today, but then later on we will build upon these theories and we'll talk about the international business aspects of international trade. I'm also going to add a separate lecture where I will specifically talk about job outsourcing and imports. It's clearly part of international trade, but it's a part that is not always discussed in detail in economics, especially given that it has many emotional and psychological aspects to it. And the reason I would like to discuss it is because this is a hot topic. It's a hotly debated topic in just about any country, and one that is often misunderstood. So I want to devote enough time to it so you have a clear idea as to what are the kind of, why job outsourcing happens and who wins and who loses in the process. So first, some statistics on international trade, who trades with whom. This map here shows you a in a sense, international trade rating of countries based on the percentage which international trade, in this case international trade volume, constitutes as a percentage of the nation's GDP. As you understand, you can't just look at the level of or amount of imports and exports and then decide which country is more internationalized or engages in more international trade or not. You have to adjust it by the size of the economy, by the GDP. And so as you can see here, smaller countries, especially those in Europe and Asia, tend to score higher on international trade dimensions. One of the biggest reasons for that would be that first, size matters. So for example, when you look at the United States, it's actually at the bottom of the list, so it seems like it doesn't trade much. The truth is that the United States trades a lot. I mean, goods and services move there a lot. The problem is that it's a huge country. It's almost an entire continent. And when you sell a product from, let's say, New York to LA, in the United States, the product would travel a huge distance. It's like just a week if you drive non-stop to cross, to drive from LA to New York. But because it's one country, it will not be counted as international trade. If you go to Europe, on the other hand here, you would see that most of these countries trade a lot, or it seems like they trade a lot. But the problem is, again, if you happen to be in Belgium or Luxembourg or the Netherlands, products moving even for a few kilometers or miles normally would be crossing borders, and so as a result, that relatively short distance movement would constitute international trade, and so as a result you get here a very high volume of trade as compared to the GDP of the country. And then obviously you have some smaller countries, especially in Asia, like more or less like states located on islands like Singapore, Taiwan. Those have been historically been ports and historically have been engaged in trade, and lots of goods are moving through those countries, in many cases actually moving on to China and Europe and North America. But because so much goes through the country, it actually seems like it trades a lot, and it does, but it's a historic consequence in a sense. You should also know that about 80% of international trade is merchandise, so we're talking about things that you can touch, like electronics and things like that, maybe oil, maybe other commodities. Only about 20% of international trade are services, and services are growing. In fact, not so long ago it was pretty much all merchandise, but still constitute a fairly small percentage of international trade. Now, if you look at the top exporters in the world, so here is by basically billions of dollars and as a percentage of the world. And so you would see that China is now #1, and it exports about 11% of all the things exported in the United States, in the world. The United States is now #2, but closely followed by Germany. And especially if you adjust the volume of exports by the size of the economy, then clearly again Germany would be on top of the list. China still remains fairly high up, and those other countries sometimes maybe more exporting than the United States, again adjusted for the size of the economy. China's exports are huge and growing, and probably will remain huge and growing, and all the other countries on the list actually seem to be doing fairly well. South Korea is expanding rapidly, so there will be some probably changes in these rankings within the next several years. When you look at the exports of services, then the United States, UK, Germany are on top of the list. In fact, the United States is on top of the list by a huge margin. And so by services here, we would see all kinds of primarily financial services, but then also some technical expertise, consulting, those kinds of things. Who trades with whom? Well, I have here some numbers, and you're welcome to look at them. You probably will forget them anyway, so I'll just give you a kind of basic rule. The rule generally is that rich trade with rich, poor trade with poor, and neighbors trade with each other. So, for example, if you look at the trade, for example, between the United States or North America and Europe, there would be much more exchange of goods going on between those two regions. But then when you look at countries like, for example, what you would have in Latin America or in Africa, you will see they actually tend to trade a lot with each other as well. So, but again, it's becoming more mixed, and in many cases it depends on who has expertise in which areas. So China is becoming the leader of merchandise exports, but mainly kind of cheaper goods still. More and more high-tech, but still cheaper goods. Germany historically, for example, has had huge, wonderful wonderful technologies, and so they've been always leaders in exports of high-tech stuff, and so on and so forth. Now, here's a very interesting study that I encourage you to read, and I have it in your optional readings folder. The study looked at how different factors contribute to the level of international trade. And so they had a whole range of things that could have an effect on international trade level, including things like the wealth of the nation, the distance between the two nations in kilometers, the size of the countries, access to the border, common border, access to the ocean, common language, all those kinds of things. I encourage you to pause here and try and estimate the effect or strength of the effect of each of these factors on international trade. Just basically think, which of those do you think are most important, most predictive of international trade? And here are some of the answers. You can read the whole paper in the optional readings folder, but here is what we can see. So, for example, countries that have a colonizer history tend to trade much more than countries that don't have that history. I mean, literally 9 times as much likely to trade than just countries that are located in the same distance, are same in all respects, but never have had that colonizer history. In fact, it was so bad, all those historic connections have been so influential, that up until the cell phones became ubiquitous, when you had the landline phones, when you would be calling from one African country to another, if both happened to be former colonies of the UK, in most cases the signal will travel first to the UK, to London, via the wires, and then back to the neighboring country in Africa, just because historically everything has been built around the colonizer common trade. And so it's so hardwired now, all the infrastructure is in place, that it's very difficult to break those connections. And I'm not saying that they have to be broken, I'm just saying that in many cases that's a huge factor. And so you still would see a lot of trade between those countries, even though now the colonies declared independence and basically can function independently. Then common currency matters a lot. And so once, for example, the EU implemented the common currency, the euro, or new countries joined the union and started using that currency, the trade started growing dramatically. And so when you look at, for example, Canada and the United States, even though there are no huge restrictions on trade between these two countries, the common currency is still a problem. There is no common currency, and so the countries trade a lot, but probably would trade even more, substantially more, if they were to adopt a common, some sort of like Can dollar or something like that, Canadian dollar, Camara, I guess they say that it would be called Canadian American dollar if it was ever implemented. Common regional trade in blocks like NAFTA or EU or Asian or anything else. And then obviously again, access to the border, common border, access to the ocean, all those matter a lot. Now here's a question that I would like you to answer to make sure that you've been following me. And the correct answer is C. The United States is #1 exporter of services in the world. Now, let's look at some theories of international trade. We're going to look at the ones on this graph, but before we get into the details, I would like to point out that new theories of international trade are offered on a regular basis. In most cases, they don't really invalidate what was before, so it's not that they say, oh, everything before this theory was wrong, now how it really works. In most cases, they just refine or add some interesting and important aspects or information that explains who trades with whom and who should trade with whom. Sometimes, however, a new theory basically tells us that the old one was wrong. So, for example, when the absolute advantage theory was proposed, it made it pretty obvious that mercantilism was not a good theory. In fact, it would lead to decisions that would not make you richest. The predictions or prescriptions it would give are not the best ones. So let's talk about some of the most known ones, and just keep in mind that there is a good chance in a few years new theories will be offered, and there is a very good chance what I'm telling you now by then will be outdated, or people will know, or economists will know much more. So, but anyway, here is what we know so far. Actually, before I get into the theories, I would like to quote here Paul Krugman, the Nobel Prize winner in 1993, who said, and I believe that's a very important statement. You probably will forget it, but if you understand this one, you will have a much easier time explaining and predicting who should trade with whom and what happens when two countries trade and how it works. And so his advice here is that when you talk about international trade, it's extremely important to think about countries as people, not as corporations. So countries are more like people rather than like corporations. And the difference is the following. When you have corporations engaging in international trade or trade in general, in most cases they have some sort of an external customer. So they have people whom they compete for, or clients whom they compete for. And that often creates sort of a zero-sum game, or at least a zero-sum game philosophy. So if company A gets the contract and company B doesn't get the contract, it's a company's B's loss, right? So if my company didn't get the contract, it's my loss and it's your gain. And so it's more of a competition there. So there is an external customer who want to get his or her money, and we compete as companies for his or her money. And so I want you to be worse, because the worse you are, the better off I am. When we talk about countries, it's more like people. Imagine you have a bunch of people in one room or on one island. When they trade, when they engage in exchange of goods or services, they're not competing for somebody else's attention. They just engage in mutually beneficial exchange. You scratch my back, I scratch your back. You make my pens, I make your, build your house or paint your house. You repair my car, I will teach you accounting. Those kinds of things. So it's more of a mutually beneficial exchange rather than competition for something else. And so it's very important to think about that, because otherwise you may overlook potential benefits of international trade if you think that every time another nation develops and gains something, that you would lose at that same moment. No, it's not the case. Now, in order to explain to you some of the theories of international trade, I'm going to give you a bunch of kind of real-life examples. And again, in most cases, it will be a simplified version of a real situation, but it should be fairly easy for you in that simplified version to think what's the right thing to do. And once you understand that, chances are it will be something that one of the theories prescribes or predicts. So let's do it one by one. So first, a real-life challenge. Imagine that there is a country called Exemplania. It's a relatively rich country. It has an advanced technology. It wants to gain as much as possible from international trade with its neighbors and maybe even colonies, right? It currently trades with other rich nations as well as with its resource-rich colonies. And so imagine that you're a consultant, and the king of Exemplania hired you to provide an advice on whether or not Exemplania should trade, and if so, what they should buy and what they should sell. And basically, it's up to you to recommend what the proper course of actions with respect to international trade would be. To give you a better example, or since Exemplania is a hypothetical country, I'm going to give you a more concrete example. Imagine that it's the Great Britain of I don't know, 300 years ago. So rich country, has some rich neighbors, has some poor colonies. What advice would you give to the king of that country with respect to international trade so that the results will make the British as rich as possible? So forget about the ethics and everything else. What would make them the most, the filthy rich country? Now, while you're thinking about your answer, and I encourage you to pause here and think what you would give, I'm going to tell you what most of my students recommend. Most of them would say, well, if you want to be rich and if you have the resources and the technology, it's probably best to try to buy natural resources. It's probably best to try to sell finished goods, because this is where the profits are. And some people even say try to oppress your weaker neighbors or colonies as much as possible. So if you see that they're developing the capacity for making high-tech products, you might want to intervene and deprive them of that capacity or destroy that capacity, so that you are the only one who can process goods, so that they remain only the natural resource exporters, basically, banana countries as they call them, right? Some even say that you will probably run a trade surplus, and so you probably will sell for a larger number of dollars or pounds or whatever currency you use than you buy from your colonies or neighbors. In which case, just convert that wealth, that surplus, into gold and hold it, for the rainy day. And if that's your prediction, and if it makes sense to you, that's basically what mercantilism would prescribe. And it says, yes, try to sell as much as possible, especially high-tech stuff. Try to maintain trade surplus. Government interventions are welcome. So if somebody's trying to sell you high-tech, impose all kinds of import barriers, exploit colonies as much as possible. But this theory is just basically plain wrong. It just doesn't work. It's not how you maximize your wealth. Well, one of the biggest challenges here is that it assumes that zero-sum game. So it assumes that every time you get something, they lose, and vice versa. If they get something, you lose. And it's not quite, quite the right assumption, and we'll discuss in a minute why. And also it limits your colony's market potential. If you try to keep them as a supplier of natural resources and buyer of the finished goods, you basically are bound to keep them poor. And the problem with that is that if you keep them poor, you can't really get much in exchange from them. And let me explain it in a different way. Again, let's think about countries as people. Would you like to have neighbors who are poor and unskilled, or neighbors who are skilled and rich? And if you are like me, you probably want to have neighbors who are skilled and rich. And the reason for that is, if they are skilled and if they are rich, on the one hand, they can buy more from you, so they can give you more money. On the other hand, they can offer you more. So if your neighbor is a bum who is not uneducated, unskilled, what can he offer you? I mean, maybe rake your leaves in the garden, maybe, I don't know, something simple. But if a neighbor happens to be a talented, I don't know, an accountant, architect, whatever else, the value of his services to you are also much greater. So the better off your neighbors are, the more you can get from them, and the more you can give them as well. And so that makes you better off. You want to live in an area where other people are highly skilled individuals, highly motivated individuals who can work with you and support you more and get more from you. That's how you build wealth. So don't look at them as enemies or competitors. Look at them as your basically neighbors. And so once you look at the neighboring countries like that, you'll understand why it's in nobody's interest to have, for example, poor colonies in Africa or poor Russia or any other country. You can make more money as, let's say, the United States, Germany, Canada, developed nations, if your neighbors are also developed. Now here's another challenge. Imagine a situation where you have two countries and you have two products. You have, let's say, for example, Portugal and Finland, and you have two products, wine and cell phones. All right. Now imagine that Portugal is very good at making wine. The climate is good, the grapes grow very well there, so they can make a bottle of good wine at $1 a bottle. They're not very good at making cell phones, so it costs them about $30 to make a cell phone. Finland, on the other hand, is a different country that is very good at making cell phones. They have the technology, but not very good at making wine because cold climate, grapes don't grow. So in Finland, it costs only $1 to make a cell phone, and it would cost them $30 to make a bottle of wine. Now again, imagine that you're hired by the Prime Minister of, let's say, Finland and asked, so should I trade? And if so, what should I sell? What should I buy? Now pause and think about your answer, and if you are like most, no doubt that you have the answer right away. I mean, clearly Finland will be better off by making cell phones, selling cell phones, using the money to buy wine, and so by doing so they can make more money or will have more wealth, will be able to consume more products than if they decided to make both products. And the opposite is true for Portugal. Very simple, very intuitive, makes perfect sense, and that's what the absolute advantage theory is about. So basically the theory says that in order to maximize wealth, you have to find the product that you are best at and focus on making that product, selling it to everyone else, using the profits to buy everything else for yourself. You don't want to waste your time on making wine when it's so expensive to make wine and it's cheaper to buy from Portugal. You should be making cell phones because this is what you make best and better than others, right? In the actual example, and I believe it was provided by Adam Smith, it was France and the UK. France making wine and the UK making wool. So if the UK can make wool, grow sheep and make wool products better than growing wine grapes and making wine, then they shouldn't try to make them both. They should outsource the one that the other neighbor country makes better. Makes perfect sense. And if you're not sure again still how it works, again, let's use people as countries. Imagine that you have two individuals, Tiger Woods, and you have Joe the plumber. If you are from the United States and if you're older, you probably know who Joe the plumber is. This is the guy who became known when he asked some questions of Barack Obama in the 2004 presidential race. And so some of the comments he made were kind of controversial, and so he became very known for his questions and then also some personal aspects of his business life. But doesn't matter, just a plumber. So imagine that you have these two individuals, and imagine that one of them is excellent at fixing toilets if they get clogged. The other one is excellent at playing golf and advertising for Nike. And so imagine that Tiger Woods makes $10,000 an hour from Nike for advertising for Nike, whereas Joe the plumber makes $50 an hour as a plumber. Now imagine that one morning Tiger Woods wakes up and sees that his toilet is clogged. The question is, should Tiger Woods fix his toilet himself, or should Tiger Woods outsource fixing of his toilet to Joe the plumber? And the answer is so obvious that yes, absolutely, Joe the plumber should be hired, because for Tiger Woods, the time he will spend fixing the toilet, it will be the time lost and the earnings lost, because he could have spent that time advertising for Nike. For Joe the plumber, I forgot to say that, yes, imagine that Nike wants to I don't know, advertise a new line of products called Everyday Max and is willing to pay Joe the plumber $25 an hour. So clearly Joe the plumber makes more money by fixing toilets than by advertising for Nike. So he probably should focus on fixing toilets because this is where he has a real profit. So obvious, so simple that there is absolutely no way you could get it wrong. And absolutely, I'm sure you understand what the absolute advantage theory says and prescribes, right? Now, let me ask you this. So we understand how the theory works, but in many cases we don't quite understand where our nation is best at. I'm going to use America as an example here, but if you're from a different country or in a different country, you probably want to use your country as an example. And so the question becomes, for your country, what would be the product that nobody else can make better than your country? And again, I'm not familiar much with other countries, but I'm familiar with the United States, so I'm going to give examples for the United States. For example, tourism, right? There is only one Grand Canyon, there is only one New York City, and there are wonderful places all around the planet, but if you want to see those places, America is basically not in competition, so it's the only place. You have to come here. America seems to be a uniquely positioned country to provide services in English as a second language training. So not only does it have lots of people who speak English, but also it seems like American English is becoming the standard English, and so wonderful Americans or America in general are positioned to provide this sort of service. America also tends to be best at customer service. Historically, the country knows how to cater to customers, so high expectations very much so here. Long history of quality service, so it would be not many countries can provide services better than the United States can. Plus military. Again, historically the United States has experienced personnel, super advanced weapons, so it seems like there is not much competition in this sector for the United States, especially for some systems that nobody else makes. Good or bad, I'm not to judge, I'm just saying that, you know, these are some of the areas. Other countries may have areas that they are best at, and so again, I strongly encourage you to pause here, and if you happen to have ties to another country, think about where your country has the absolute advantage, where your country is best or better than others at. Here is a question for you, and clearly the answer is B, mercantilism. Now, this is where it gets more challenging and trickier, so we're moving on to the theories that have been proposed much later. So the first two, that's hundreds of years ago. Now, more recent stuff. Imagine the situation where you have, again, two products, two countries, grapes and wine, Portugal and Finland. But imagine, I don't know, with the global warming on the way, imagine that the climate has changed, and imagine that Portugal now has a very dry, very hot climate and can no longer grow grapes efficiently. At the same time, the climate in Finland has warmed up, and now Finland can not only make cell phones very cheaply at $1 a piece, but also can make wine fairly cheaply because now it's warm enough there, and I don't know, enough rain, and so plus it developed the technology, and so now Finland can make cell phones $1 a piece and wine at $5 a gallon or a bottle. Now Portugal still cannot make cell phones well, so it's still going to cost them $20 to make a cell phone, and because of the changes in climate, let's imagine that now it costs them $10 to make a gallon of wine or a bottle of wine. So you have a situation where Finland is better at making both wine and cell phones. And imagine that you're hired as a consultant to the Finnish Prime Minister, and the question is, should Finland trade, and if so, what would they sell, what would they buy? Give it some thought, pause here, give it some thought. If you are like my students, you would basically give two answers. One would be, yes, trade, still try to sell cell phones and buy wine. But then somebody in the audience says, no, that's a bad idea. Why would you want to buy wine from Portugal when you can make it cheaper in Finland? And yes, I mean, really, would you like to buy wine from Portugal when you can make it cheaper in Finland? Why would you even want to trade? If everything is cheaper to be made domestically, why would you want to buy it from someone else? Eventually, some students figure out that it's all about opportunity cost. Yes, technically, you shouldn't buy because you can make it cheaper. However, you can make bigger profits on cell phones, and if you decide to make wine as well, you will be wasting your resources on goods that you may be making better than others, but that are not so profitable to you. If you want to play with the numbers a little bit, I have here a scenario where you know how much Finland and Portugal will generate wealth or consume wealth under different scenarios, and I encourage you to spend some time and look at this math. But let me give you an example from a real kind of live people as countries context, which will explain very well how that works, and you will understand very well what I'm talking about here. Again, imagine that we have here again Joe the plumber, and we have in this case Michael Jordan, the basketball player. Same situation, Michael Jordan gets $10,000 for advertising for Nike, Joe the plumber gets $50 an hour as a plumber, $25 as a Nike advertiser. But in this case, it happens to be the case, and I'm making it up completely, but just for the sake of argument, let's imagine that Michael Jordan, I don't know, grew up in a neighborhood where his neighbor, his uncle, was a plumber. And let's say Michael Jordan was a very talented boy, and so he quickly learned how to fix toilets. And so imagine that now you have Michael Jordan, who is not only much better at advertising for Nike, but also is much better at fixing toilets. He can fix a toilet in much less time and at a much better quality than Joe the plumber can. And so Michael Jordan wakes up and sees that his toilet is clogged. So the question is basically the same. Should Michael Jordan fix the toilet himself, or should he hire Joe the plumber at $50 an hour? Now, again, remember, Michael Jordan can fix the toilet much faster, much more efficiently, at much better quality. But no person in his right mind would say that Michael Jordan should do that job, because every hour he spends on fixing that toilet, he loses $10,000 he could earn by advertising for Nike. Clearly, even though he's better than Joe the plumber, he should hire Joe the plumber so he can focus on the product that is most profitable for him. Makes perfect sense once you think about it in the context of people, and that's exactly the same thing in the context of countries, and that's what the comparative advantage theory says. Even if you are best at everything, you are still better off by buying some stuff, because if you decide to make everything in the house, you will be inevitably making some things that are less profitable to you, and you shouldn't. Pump all your resources towards making the stuff that is most profitable, the stuff where you make the most money. Buy everything else. Even if you can make that everything else cheaper than your neighbors, still you're better off by outsourcing that, because you don't want to spend your time on things that are less profitable. At the same time, what this tells us, that if you are not best at anything, like if you happen to be a country that doesn't have any absolute advantages, it doesn't make anything better than the neighbors, you still may have your place in the world economy. You still may be making things that even though others make better than you make, they may still be interested in buying it from you, because for them it's a less profitable product, so you can still be able and should be offering that product to them. So basically, you know, the rule prescription: find what's most profitable for you, make that stuff, buy everything else. And if you happen to be not best at anything, no big deal. There are many products that many countries would be happy to outsource to you, just because they can make somewhat more money on other products. Make sense? Now, here is a tough question. Makes perfect sense, seems very clear, and, yes, absolutely, of course, especially if you put it in the context of Joe the plumber and Michael Jordan. The question is why this theory is not a perfect one. Yes, it's a good theory, but why it doesn't always work. Now, this is where my students get really confused, and in most cases can't really come up with good examples. But there are many, many limitations to this theory. One, in many cases, nations, when they decide, to trade or not to trade, it's not all about maximizing production and consumption and making as much profits as possible. Often there are all kinds of social concerns, in many cases also emotional, political issues. So for example, unemployment. If you have some unemployment, you probably want to keep your people employed, and even though economically it doesn't make sense, politically it does. Sometimes you don't want to trade with some nations because you don't like them. Sometimes they don't want to trade with you because they don't like you, all kinds of reasons. Second, the theory ignores transportation cost and production relocation cost. Yes, it may be the case that Portugal makes wine cheaper, but maybe by the time you transport wine from Portugal to Finland, it will cost much more. Same thing, let's say, for example, Finland decided to outsource wine production to Portugal, but let's say the capacity, all the machinery and all the tools are in Finland. By the time you relocate all that stuff, by the time you teach the locals, it may actually be more expensive than just do it, in your country automatically. Likewise, the comparative advantage theory assumes 100% employment and resource use. So it assumes that if you decided to make both wine and, for example, cell phones, you will literally have to move some people from making cell phones to making wine, which is counterproductive because cell phones are more profitable. But what if your country does have unemployment? What if, adding more production capacity, in wine doesn't necessarily mean taking people from the cell phone production? Likewise, if you have a different country, and if they have some resources, for example, and they need them to be used internally, the comparative advantage theory assumes that you can get anything from them that you want to get from them. But in reality, maybe they will not want to sell you that product. Maybe they don't have enough for even internal consumption. Maybe they don't want to sell it to you for other reasons, and so it's not always so clean. So it assumes perfect economic conditions. So again, trade is free. You can sell whatever you want, and they will buy whatever you want to sell them. They will sell you whatever you want to buy, and they will, and you can pay for it. So there is no protectionism. There are no tariffs. There is no politics. There are no other types of barriers. And in reality, it's often not the case. So here is a question for you. Let's see if you will be able to give the answer. And the answer clearly is, even though South Korea in this scenario can make both products cheaper, it will probably be richer by focusing on making microchips and buying rice from China. Now, factor proportions theory is kind of a refinement of the previous two, and it just says that there are two different types of factors. So you have basically human factors or human resources, and you have natural resources. And so it says here that countries that have a lot of human resources, so they have either a lot of people at a low price or a lot of expertise and talented people, you probably want to focus on the products where a lot of labor is needed or some human capital is needed, like, for example, again, labor intensive or highly expertise intensive types of jobs. On the other hand, it says if you happen to have natural resources, like, for example, oil or land or climate or whatever else, that's what you should focus on. So you should focus on products that require all that, capital or machinery or commodities that you may have that others don't have. So in a sense, it's not saying you much new beyond what's been said. It just helps you to determine where you may have the absolute or competitive advantage. Now, here's another question that I would like you to ask, and let's see if you would know the answer. And the correct answer obviously is opportunity cost. Now, here's a different theory, and this one is called product life cycle theory. It applies best to manufactured goods, I guess, and I'm going to use computers as an example to explain how it works. And essentially, this theory takes same product but explains who would be making it and who would be buying it at different stages of the product's life. And so at the core of the theory is the recognition that products go through multiple stages of their development or life. Initially, the product is new, nobody can make it, and only those who would be able to make it at that time should probably make it and sell to everybody else. So for example, if you take the computers in the 80s, it was a new product. Only really the United States, maybe Germany, maybe Japan could make those, but again, really the United States was #1 mover. And so the United States clearly at that time was in a position to make and sell those computers, and everybody else was pretty much buying them from the United States. Then in the 90s, other countries learned how to make computers, notably again some European nations like Germany, Japan. And so at that time, making computers in Germany or Japan cost probably about as much as in the United States. The United States still could make them very well, but others have learned as well how to make them. And so this is probably the time when you would see computers made both in the United States and elsewhere, and then traded internationally. And then finally in the 2000s, computers became what we call a standardized product. Everybody can make them, they're easy to make, even countries that have low technological development can easily learn and make computers. And so this is what it would look like when you look at the graphs who buys and who sells. So the United States in the early stages of the computer revolution would be making computers more than they need and sell the surplus to other nations. Then as the computers become more standardized, more mature products, others learn how to make them and start also making them along with the United States, and also export them and sell internationally. But then as the product becomes standardized, as everybody learns how to make it, for the United States it doesn't make sense to keep making them. It's better to just outsource the production to, for example, China or Taiwan, and buy them from there. And so this is what that graph would look like for the second mover, like for example Japan. So first buys, then buys, but at some point starts making. And that's basically less developed countries. So they buy, always buy, and only much later they start selling those computers, or making them and selling them. The limitations of this theory are, well, there are several. One, it does apply only to some particular goods, like for example computers, like tangible goods. Doesn't really work with other types of products, or in many cases it would not be so clean. You can probably apply it to services, but again it wouldn't be as clean, as predictive as otherwise it would be. Second, today the product life cycle is much shorter, and in many cases it's a matter of months or years, years or actually months more often before the product becomes standardized. So kind of happens much faster and not as cleanly divided as it used to be. Also, for some products, the country of origin matters a lot, even if other countries can make it better. Like for example, when you look at luxury goods, like for example, I don't know, watches, right? So even though China can probably make watches no worse than Switzerland, but when people buy a luxury watch, arm watch, they pay for the location in many cases, not for the product itself. So they want the product to be from Switzerland, not from China. And so even though at this stage the product would be standardized and it would make sense economically to outsource the production to China, but in reality you have to make them in Switzerland if you want to sell them, right? So also again, most products these days are not really made somewhere. I mean, if you look at just about anything, it's not like it's made 100% in the United States or Latvia or Ukraine or Lithuania or China or anything else. It's extremely multinational these days, and so it's not so easy to split it, you know, now it's made here and tomorrow it's going to be made in another country. Now let me ask you another question, so let's see if you know the answer. And the answer clearly is A, right? And if you are taking my class for credit, you will probably see a question on the exam like this one, and if so, I will even provide pictures from the slides so you can visualize the links in your head and easier recall the answers. Now, national competitive advantage theory by Michael Porter, so another Nobel Prize winner, kind of puts it all together. And so he basically says that there are four different, again, factors in a sense, or components, which determine who makes what and who should make what and sell and buy what. All right, let's talk about them one by one. I will warn you that there will be a question later on where I will ask you which of the 5 factors listed in the question is not in Porter's diamond, as it's called. So you better memorize these 4. But let's talk about them one by one. First, the so-called factor conditions. And by factor conditions, we mean either geography or natural resources, or some what they call advanced factors, where you would have some sort of skills, or so basically the basic necessities that you need to make the product: materials and human capital. If I were to use, for example, Italy and the Italian ceramic tile industry as an example, we would say yes, Italy has the factory conditions. It has the right geography, the right climate, so it has the natural resource needed to make ceramic tile, like the clay that they use and whatever else goes into making that product. It also has the human talent. So when Italy was completely destroyed in the Second World War, construction was an important part of the business, and so industries to rebuild the country. They created all kinds of schools and special training colleges and apprenticeship programs. So now Italy has both the natural resources to make the product and the human resources to make the product, uniquely positioned to make this particular product. Right? It's also very important to remember that factory conditions change over time. So climate changes, natural resources get depleted, people get more trained or forget some skills. So just because, for example, today country A is uniquely positioned to make a product in terms of the basic and the advanced factors, tomorrow it may not be the case. In fact, one of the good examples I've heard was the Burgundy wine. So historically, Burgundy wine is made or was made in France, in Burgundy region. That's why it's called Burgundy wine. And 200 years ago, that's basically where it was all made. But now with the climate changes, the climate becoming drier and hotter in Burgundy, actually, if you want to get the authentic, wonderful Burgundy wine, like the way it must be, then you would probably want to buy it from South Wales in the UK, because that's where today's climate is reminiscent or like that in Burgundy 200 years ago. Likewise, we'll always look at China, or tend to look at China, for example, as a country that makes cheap products using cheap labor. But again, it's changing. China is investing a lot of money in education, and more talented and skilled people are residing in China. And so China now more, and probably soon even more, will be emerging as a manufacturer or provider of high-tech services and goods. Demand conditions. This one is very interesting. So Porter says that in order for a country to have that competitive edge, in order to develop that expertise, the country has to have strong internal demand. So it's not enough to just simply have the resources, human or natural, to make a product. You must have that domestic demand for the product. And so again, going back to, for example, Italian tile industry, well, after the Second World War, the country was destroyed and a lot of construction had to be happening, so there was a lot of demand. So they had the natural resources, they trained the people, and there was enough demand to give that initial boost to the industry and to make sure that it sprouts and becomes very competitive, and then also sells internationally. Another good example would be, for example, the United States with its IT industry. So the United States is still number one in software development. Microsoft is here, Sun Microsystems is here, Apple with its Mac OS and whatever else software. One of the big reasons the United States is so good at it is because not only it has the talented people to make this stuff, but there is also, again, strong demand for this kind of product in the country. So Americans are rich enough to pay for software. So when you go, for example, to China, you probably can buy the Windows, software, like, I don't know, the disk with Windows, Microsoft Windows, or Photoshop for that matter, for literally like a couple of bucks. And so there is not enough protection for the property rights on the one hand. On the other hand, not many people who are willing to pay a lot of money for licensed products. So even if you happen to create a company in China that makes software, there would be not much internal demand for expensive software products. So as a result, it would be very difficult for you to create this initial foundation before you can go global. The United States does have that, and so the IT industry can be sustained by the demand from American consumers, and so it becomes so good at it that it also sells them internationally. Another one very important factor is related and supporting industries. The truth is that today just about any product, to make it, it requires all kinds of support industries. It's not just you who decided to make cars or computers. You have to have a whole range of industries that will make that product possible. So, for example, again, if we talk about Italian ceramic tile, you would see that it's not all about the actual production of ceramic tile. It's also, the whole industry that makes, glazes that you put on tile. It's a whole industry that advertises the product, the logistics. So a lot of stuff going on. And so in many cases, you would have those what they call production clusters. And again, I'm familiar with the United States. I'm going to use it as an example, but you can probably think of the same clusters in other regions of the world. So for example, in the United States, we have, let's say, the Silicon Valley. That's where you have the IT industry. So if you want to make computers or software, that's where you want to be, because if you want to make some high-tech gadgets, you need all those different areas of expertise. And so let's say you're making, tablets or cell phones. If you are in the Silicon Valley, you need software. You just walk out of your office, shout, and there will be 25 software engineers right there. If you want some chips, if you want some programming, so that's where you will find your support. If you want to make movies, you go to the Hollywood, right? Because this is where there are actors, there are screenwriters, there are operators, there are stunt people, all those kinds of support industries. If you want to make cars, you go to Detroit. That's where the car industry is residing. So that's where you will find, designers, engineers, metal, steels, steel mills, all kinds of support industries that you need for the industry. Here in North Carolina, you would have furniture, and while not much furniture is still made here, but you would still have this region as a center. This is where the exhibitions happen. This is where most of the designers live. So this region is known for furniture. Plus, also North Carolina here is specializing in logistics, shipping, in financial services, as well as research and development. So all that kind of stuff is important because, again, you can't develop a product in vacuum. You need all that support, components, parts, services, expertise, and you want to be in one of those clusters. So you probably will find the same clusters in Europe, you will find them in Asia, in Latin America, anywhere else, right? Let me illustrate the importance of support industries using a few examples. For example, do you know what country is the biggest exporter of diamonds by the value? So which country basically makes most money on diamonds? My students normally would say like South Africa, or maybe Russia, or maybe Canada, because those are the countries that have diamonds in their soil. But no, the answer is Israel. Even though Israel doesn't have the actual natural resource, it doesn't have that rock in the soil, they're so good at the supporting industries, logistics, advertisement, cutting, polishing diamonds, that they actually make more money on diamonds than the countries that actually have diamonds. And the countries that actually have diamonds, in many cases, don't have those support industries, so they can still extract the rock from the soil, but they don't really know what to do with it. And so in many cases, they would literally just sell it to Israel, and then Israel will polish it, will sell it, will advertise it, will track it, so and then eventually makes more money. So evidently, it's not all about having the natural resources, it's also about having the whole infrastructure in place. Likewise, when you go to China, and I'm not sure if that's still the case, but 10 years ago it certainly was. And so imagine that you go to China, walk into a store, look around, and you see some products on the shelves there. What do you think, or where do you think was the company located that put that product on the shelves? And again, most people say, well, probably in China. I mean, China makes those products. Well, not really. In most cases, it's actually Taiwan. So China, at least again 10 years ago, was very good at making products, but not so good at moving products around. And so in most cases, what would happen is the retailers would place their order with a Taiwanese company, which will then forward that order to a Chinese manufacturer who will make the product, sell it to the Taiwanese company, who will then ship it to the retailer and basically puts it on the shelves. And so Taiwan is very good at logistics management, at retailing management, and so in many cases, even though the product would never physically leave China, it would actually on paper go through a company in Taiwan, because that's where they excel. They're very good at this technical and market knowledge. Just historically, as a nation port, they have developed that expertise. And so what I'm trying to say here is that the support industries sometimes are more important than the actual capability of making the product. And firm strategy and rivalry. So again, if you want to be good at something, you want to have companies that are very good at this product, and ideally want to have competition for that product. So for example, when we talk about the United States, one of the reasons you have a very strong IT and computer industry is because there is a lot of expertise in this area and a lot of competition. Apple, Google, Microsoft, Adobe, SAS, I mean, those guys make all that stuff, but they're ready to, they compete fiercely, they sometimes help each other, but they also sometimes try to kill each other. But by fighting with one another, they become so strong that when it's, you know, about international competition, not many companies or countries can compete with them. I mean, you have so much expertise here, and you have to be so good to survive here that, you know, by the time you're done, you know, international competition, there's no competition for you. So you want to have those strong companies, because eventually, or effectively, or in the end, ultimately, the expertise, you know, the products reside within companies, not within countries overall. Now, if I had to make predictions where, based on Porter's diamond, the United States will be, or what the United States will be making in the future, well, I'm going to share my prediction in a minute, but I recommend or suggest that you pause here and think your country. If you're in the United States, great. If you are from somewhere else or somewhere else, think for a while, what does your country, or what are the products or services where your country has the basic and advanced factors, supporting industries, internal demand, and firm strategy and competition. For different countries it would be something else, but for the United States I believe it's going to be the electric vehicles. The reasons are the following. So the United States does have the basic conditions, so it has you know, a lot of sun to generate electricity, for example. It has all the natural resources needed to make cars, as well as human expertise. So all the IT guys, all the manufacturers of cars are here. So you have definitely enough capacity to actually make that stuff. You have strong internal demand. Electric vehicles still tend to be quite expensive. And so while other countries are very good, or may be very good at making this product, they may just not have enough internal demand or enough people in the country who are able to pay for this kind of product. In the United States, many people are environmentally cautious. They want to save the environment, and they have the money to buy these presumably more environmentally friendly cars. There are all support industries in place. You have the Silicon Valley, you have the technology, everything is right here. And then you have strategy and competition. You have a number of car manufacturers here who make those kinds of products, and there is enough competition. You obviously have Tesla, but then also GM is experimenting with electrical vehicles. Toyota makes some electrical vehicles here. Nissan makes Nissan Leaf. You also had Fiske, right? Is that the name of the company? And it seems like they're out of business, but they were here. So you have all that, you know, stuff going on. Plus, on top of that, there seems to be government support. Many states offer tax credits if you buy an electrical vehicle, so there is a very, very good chance that's where the United States will do well. And literally 2 days ago, Apple announced that it's going to start making cars by 2020, so electric vehicles. So yeah, my prediction is the United States will do very well in this area. Now here's another question for you. The graph above relates to which of the following international trade theories? And the answer clearly is, it's the product life cycle. Oh, here is another one. And as promised, yes, one of them is not in the Porter's diamond, and that's the product development stage. I just made it up, and so it's not part of the diamond. So these are the questions that you will likely see on the exam. Now, all these economic theories are wonderful and explain very well who trades with whom or who should trade with whom, but in reality it's a little bit different, or often it's not as simple. And so let me talk about some of the things that are kind of non-economic factors or other issues related to international trade that are not quite touched upon by the economic theories that we just discussed. One of them is that in the modern world, when we talk about production of products, made in is becoming more of a label of where the product was assembled, or where it was last polished before it was sold, rather than where it was actually made. For example, I have a good friend who at some point decided to research where the CD player from his car came from, and it was a Hyundai Sonata, the South Korean car. And so his CD player broke and he had to buy a new one, and so he wanted to see where it's coming from. And so the car, it's a South Korean company, Hyundai, that made the car in Mexico and sold it to the United States. So right there, it's already hard to say, who's the manufacturer of that company. But then on top of that, the CD player, it had components from Taiwan and was assembled in Taiwan, but also had components from China, South Korea, and the United States. It was the assembly was finished in Mexico, and the installation was made in Mexico. And so when you look at made in that case, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't really, convey the, the whole meaning as it used to. I often ask my students, when you look at these two cars here, you have a Toyota Camry and you have a Ford Mustang. Which one of them would be more American? And so clearly people say, well, obviously Ford Mustang is an American car because, it's an American icon. It's as American as it gets. But in reality, depending on how you define American, but if you define it as the percentage of that car actually made in America, then Toyota Camry is more American than Mustang, because more components of that Toyota Camry, more value in that Toyota Camry was created in the United States than what you would see in Ford Mustang. As you can imagine, when cars are made, just about anything and everything is actually outsourced. One company makes windshields, another makes tires, another one makes electrical motors, paint, just about anything. So the car manufacturer itself literally just designs the car and then puts it together, maybe makes some components. And so even though Toyota Camry is a Japanese company, this particular model is made in the United States and has more American components and value in it than Ford Mustang, that is also made in the United States but has more components from somewhere else. So go figure. Here is a diagram that shows the Boeing Dreamliner, the Boeing 787, who makes the different components of it. And as you can see, it's a really international effort. Even the wing itself, different components of the wing are made in different countries. So can you say that it's an American product? Probably so. It's made in Seattle, Washington in the United States. That's where Boeing is headquartered. But you can't really say that it's made in the United States, because it literally comes from all around the world. Now, more examples of non-economic factors, yes, comparative advantage theory, absolute advantage theory, Porter's diamond, all wonderful and beautiful and explains who should make what. But often you see a completely different picture. For example, here on the slide you see a picture of a so-called Angora goat. And that Angora goat has very long hair, and so that's what they use to make what they call mohair. So it's basically a special sort of fabric. That's what they make sweaters from, or clothes from. And so the United States was #1 producer of that stuff in the world for a long time, up until recently. And you would think that's because maybe the United States has the unique skills or climate or something else to grow those sheep and to make the product. And in reality, no, it's not the case. The reason for that is that a long time ago, the United States was kind of afraid of potential invasion from the north. And the United States was trying to prepare its military to fight in cold climate. And at that time, it was long before the chemical industry advances. In order, the only product that you could use to make warm uniforms was this mohair. So Angora goats, hair-made products. And so at that time, the American Congress, the United States Congress, decided that it's a strategic product, and the United States should be able to make those warm uniforms. And so it started pumping money, so offered all kinds of economic incentives for American ranchers and farmers to grow those, breed those goats and make that kind of product. In 1946, the U.S. Army stopped using mohair for making uniforms. I guess synthetic materials were invented by that time that were cheaper and better quality. But because so many farmers were in this kind of industry, the Congress didn't cancel the subsidies up until 1982. And even though economically it didn't make sense to make it in the United States, nobody really needed it anymore. It would be cheaper to make that stuff in New Zealand or the UK, where the climate is more suitable for breeding Angora goats. American legislators were afraid to kill those jobs because, lost jobs, that's, you will not be elected next time. So they just kept pumping money in a product that nobody needed, and America remained number one producer of it and was sending it all around the world, even though economically it just didn't make sense. Was it good or bad? Well, for farmers, obviously it was good. You get subsidies, you get, profits. For taxpayers, it's bad because, they take money from your pockets and put it in pockets of producers of goods that you don't really need. So, sometimes it's more political than anything else. Here is another example, and I really like this one. If you happen to drive sometimes from Duluth, Minnesota to Superior, Wisconsin, listen carefully and see what you hear as you cross that bridge. That bridge was built using grant money from the federal government, and at the time when it was built, it was several decades ago. The United States was making steel, but Japan already was the number one manufacturer of steel as it is today. So Japan, historically, at least for the last couple of decades, makes steel cheaper and of better quality than anybody else. Even though they don't have the iron ore, they still develop the technology so well that they are unrivaled. In fact, that's why the United States has the so-called Rust Belt. As you probably know, some Midwestern regions are called the Rust Belt. It's because those regions specialized in producing steel, so they had all those steel mills. From Pennsylvania, and I believe it goes kind of Midwest. And at some point, Japan started making steel better than the United States, and American steel mills started going out of business. And so that's when they got that name, Rust Belt, because the whole industry started rusting, right? So when the Duluth Superior Bridge was about to be built, because it was connecting two states, you have Minnesota on one side and Wisconsin on the other side, there was some sort of a bi-state commission that was overseeing the construction. And one of the questions they had to decide on was, where do we get the steel to build the bridge? And so the Minnesotan part of the commission said, what do you mean where? Of course we're going to buy it from Minnesota. Minnesota makes steel, it's a steel producing state, and of course we're going to be patriotic, we're going to buy steel from Minnesota, support the local manufacturers, producers. The Wisconsin people said, you know what, we're not sure. We don't make steel, and to us it's it's not like it's going to give us any votes in the next state government election. So let's shop around. And they did, and they found that Japanese steel was cheaper and of better quality. And they said, we don't know, we don't want to pay more for Minnesota steel given that it's of inferior quality. And so they argued back and forth, and I'm going to tell you what conclusion they came to, but I encourage you to think and tell me, what would you do? Would you buy local steel that is more expensive and of lesser quality, or would you import it from Japan for less and of higher quality? Well, they couldn't come to a conclusion, and eventually they just went 50-50. So the Minnesota part of the bridge is built using Minnesota steel, and the Wisconsin part of the bridge is built using the Japanese steel. And sure enough, now, several decades later, you can actually hear the difference in the quality of the bridge. When you drive on the Minnesota side, you will hear this kind of rattling sound. The steel is now giving its way. Whereas the Wisconsin part of the bridge, made out of Japanese steel, still holds strong and is actually performing better. Now again, I have no idea, or I'm in no position to tell what was the right decision and what they should have done. I can see arguments of both sides, but I'm just saying that again, sometimes the decisions of who makes and who sells and buys are not purely economic and maybe much more political. Alright, so here is what you need to know on the exam. Thank you for your attention, and I will see you in the next lecture. Bye.